So I'm used to have research field, language, I'm funded by the
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Linda. I come to this with sort of different hats on, so I just thought it'd be helpful just to give you an idea of what my experience is and a little bit of information, then maybe give more time for the discussion later. So I suppose my first encounter with resettlement was when I was at the Refugee Council in 1999 as the policy officer on the interagency team that supported Kosovan evacuees and the Kosovan humanitarian evacuation program. And at that time, 4,346 Kosovans were evacuated to the UK from Macedonia over 8 weeks, plus I think it was another 61 medical evacuees. And again, compare that to the UK commitment at the moment to Syrians, which has been pretty slow in coming and quite modest, shall we say. And it's interesting that it's only yesterday that the Home Office has called in people who were involved in that programme to ask them what they'd learnt from it, which is the last time we did a major evacuation programme. I suppose a couple of the things that the voluntary sector learnt was that it was useful having a voluntary sector-led interagency team function that could coordinate what was being done. That's not happened this time. It was useful to involve the voluntary sector generally in running reception facilities. As far as we know, at the moment, the Home Office is saying it's up to local authorities to decide how they want to receive Syrian refugees. Whether they want to involve the voluntary sector or not, it's up to them. So there was various bits of learning, and a very specific bit of learning. I remember it was interesting that the reception centres that were run by the voluntary sector tended to encourage people to cook for themselves, to look after themselves, and whereas the local authority-run reception centres tended to be in former old people's homes or that kind of institution where people were catered for and looked after in every way they might, every way. And it was interesting that the people moved on from the voluntary sector-run reception centres. Nick may well speak more about this. Moved on faster from the voluntary sector-run centres than from the local authority-run reception centres. Another little anecdote from that period is my previous job was as education officer at the Refugee Council, and we just started running a reception centre in Leeds. And colleagues there rang me up and said, help, Richard, what are we going to do? It's going crazy here in the reception. There's kids running around all over the place. They're driving everyone mad. Parents are tearing their hairs out. What do we do? And I hadn't been in the job long, but I said, I'll come up and have a look and have a chat, see what we can do. So I went to the reception centre, and as I was looking around, I noticed that the kids there were outside and they were talking to other kids through a fence. I said, well, what's that? What's the other side of the fence? He said, well, it's a school. So I trotted round to the school. Said, can I see the head teacher? I said, yeah. Head teacher said, we'd love to have those kids in the school. So I went back to my colleagues and I said, why aren't the Kosovan children in the schools like the one next door? And they said, oh well, they're terribly vulnerable. It's really, they need to have special treatment. I said, but they're the same as any other asylum-seeking children, which everyone has experience of. They've also come from terrible situations. The first line of the Refugee Council policy was children should be in schools. Schools the quicker they're back to normal life, the better. So people said thank you very much, and within days those children were in their schools and everyone was very happy. And I think the lesson from that was that resettled refugees may have, in some way, may be in a better situation than asylum seekers, but they also have similar needs and in many ways should be treated in the same way. Another interesting experience that came out of that was when the first flight to Leeds came, colleagues were very worried because they as the flight was about to arrive, they got wind that people had gathered in the airport. There was a sort of local people, it looked like a demonstration. So they were a bit worried about what to do about that. And as the Kosovan evacuees came into the airport, the people who were waiting there suddenly put up these banners which said, "Welcome to England." And that, I think, shows how much potential goodwill there is out there, which we've seen over the summer, that despite the sort of poisonous debate we've had over so many years, resettlement can help create a sort of a positive, more positive attitudes towards refugees and asylum seekers. And I'm involved in a small bit of research with my colleague Richard, who's in the front row here, for Amnesty International at the moment, trying to work out how we can capitalise on that goodwill that we've seen over the summer towards Syrian refugees, and try to translate it into a broader human rights awareness and sympathy for migrants in general. Then I was just thinking about sort of soon after the whole Kosovan emergency, the European Union was involved. It was trying hard to create a sort of common European asylum system, and the first thing it did then was to create to pass a bit of legislation called the Temporary Protection Directive, which is what to do when you have a prospect of a mass influx into the EU of people seeking protection, which you might say is exactly what's happening now. And you might ask, why haven't they invoked that? And the honest answer to that is I don't know, but I suspect that the standards that they agreed, the way that people should be treated, that they agreed back in 2004, are now seen to be too generous, I suspect. And also there was an element in that directive which was about sharing the responsibility fairly across Europe, having a mechanism to do that fairly across Europe, which, as we've seen in the negotiations over this summer, has proved a particularly contentious thing at the European level. And of course the UK has said, you might want to share the burden, the responsibility fairly, but we're not playing. Interestingly, at that time when I was at the European Council for Refugees and Exiles, the idea of resettlement was quite a contentious one amongst the NGO community across Europe. Because there were many members of ECRE who were concerned that governments would, if they did resettlement, they would use it as an excuse for more border controls and more measures that would keep asylum seekers out of Europe. So the NGOs, some of the NGOs were very reluctant to endorse resettlement as something that was worthwhile. But I think, and also at that time there was quite a lot of discussion at the UN level about the strategic use of resettlement, which is exactly what can the resettlement countries get out of it that's more than just contributing to the international protection regime. How can they use resettlement as a lever to get something out of it? And what was talked about at the time was whether by offering to resettle a certain number of people from a country, you could say to that country, in return, you have to create better standards of protection for the people there, for the people who we don't take. And we're seeing that kind of dialogue going on between the EU and Turkey. We'll give you money, we'll reset a certain number of refugees, in return for which you have to let Syrians have better access to the employment market, you have to provide better education for Syrians. But also we're seeing the EU saying, and you also have to stop them coming. And I think the EU trusts Turkey to do its dirty work of preventing people moving more than it trusts Greece. In that debate within the NGO community, I think the people that won the argument were those that saying states are probably always going to do their best to prevent the movement of forced migrants, that we shouldn't be preventing something was actually a good thing for those who benefit from it, from the people who are resettled. And we should be supporting UNHCR, who say that's an important element of the international refugee regime. And when you when you see people, as we've seen over the summer, the awful pictures of people drowning in the Mediterranean, it's impossible to say that it's not a good thing to have legal routes, legal and safe routes into Europe, of which resettlement is one, and others might be enhanced family reunion or humanitarian visas, which are a very rare thing. And then sort of the third area I just wanted to mention is, so still on the European level, I've just done some work with an organisation called ICMC, the International Catholic Migration Commission, which has organised some city-to-city learning across Europe on what works on refugee resettlement, and particularly on the integration of refugees. And one of the areas that they've developed a benchmark and a toolkit on is on using volunteers. And how important volunteers are, particularly in sort of befriending schemes to facilitate the integration of resettled refugees. But also an important element was that amongst those volunteers, the people you select as volunteers may well be refugees who are already in the country. So on the visits that I went on that program, it was interesting that some cities, some nationalities perhaps, forgot that refugees who are already in their country might be a resource in this. And lastly, I was asked to talk a little bit at the local level, because I'm on the city of Sanctuary-on-Sea, which is the executive committee that runs Sanctuary-on-Sea, which is a local voluntary-run organisation as part of the national City of Sanctuary movement, which tries to make our cities more welcoming to refugees and asylum seekers. And we're in pretty close contact with the council, one of the first things we did was to lobby them to campaign, firstly, that the council should declare itself to be a welcoming city, a city of sanctuary, but secondly, that it should offer to take some Syrians on the government's relocation scheme, which it did in a resolution back in March. It said it would take a small number of families, providing accommodation could be found that wasn't on the normal social housing list, because there's such a waiting list for social housing in Brighton. It would be such a contentious, politically difficult decision to take. Otherwise, people would think that the Syrians were jumping the queue. So the council said, yes, we'll take Syrians, providing we can find private landlords who are prepared to rent accommodation to them at housing benefit levels. And so Sanctuary-on-Sea helped to try to promote that idea and advertise this call, and landlords have come forward. The council has now decided to bring 3 families between now and Christmas, who are apparently it's two families, one family with small children, one family with a disabled child, and a couple, and they're going to be living somewhere in central Brighton, and that's as much as I know at the moment. The Brighton Voices in Exile is going to be the sort of lead charity in the city that's going to support them. And I think Sanctuary on Sea will wait to see what support is needed that falls outside what's already been set up. But it is only 3 families, and I think one of the things that we've been saying to people, Sanctuary on Sea, is that it's fantastic that you're offering a room to a Syrian refugee. It's fantastic that you want to help, but actually our government doesn't let them in. And that there are many people who do need accommodation in the country, but they're not the ones that are coming on that scheme. And so if you want to help, you may help refugees, asylum seekers, please do, but they're likely to be asylum seekers or refused asylum seekers who are left destitute, who need that room more than the Syrians that are coming on the scheme. I think that's all I've got to say. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Richard.